Hey guys, Metal Jesus here. Now recently I had a good friend of mine ask me a question that was fairly simple, but incredibly tough to answer. He wanted to know what 10 games I think every gamer should eventually play. Now it's important to know that he's a bit more of a casual gamer, but he's got some time on his hands and he wants to check out the games that he's missed. As you can imagine, it is tough going through decades of games to try to come up with just 10. So in this video, I'm going to share with you the ones that I picked in each different genre, and at the end of it I also have some honorable mentions to kind of cover my butt a little bit, but I'm going to be really curious to know if you guys think I got it right. Let's take a look. Alright guys, now before we get started, I do want to mention that these games are in no particular order because I think you should play them all, and as I mentioned in the intro, I'm also going to add some honorable mentions at the end. And to get started, we're going to take a look at an RPG that I think every gamer should play at least once, and coming up with that is so hard because, you know, there are literally 40 years worth of great RPGs to choose from. You have some of the real classics like Ultima 4, which just happens to be one of my all-time favorites, as well as Planescape Torment. You have all those Baldur's Gate games. You have all the Final Fantasies. Of course, you have more recent ones like The Witcher and Skyrim, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, etc., etc. But for my money, every gamer should at least try playing Mass Effect 2 at least once. Now you may be thinking, why Mass Effect 2, the middle game in a trilogy? That seems kind of weird, right? Well, the thing is that BioWare took the lessons learned from the original game and applied all of that to the sequel. And also too, they did something smart, and that is you don't really have to have played the first game to enjoy the second. And I know that from experience because while I played the first game, my wife didn't. She jumped in on Mass Effect 2. And she just immediately had a great time with it. The thing about Mass Effect 1 is that the combat was a little clunky. That would be my biggest complaint with that game. They completely fixed that with the second game. Plus, the characters, the relationships that you can have in that game, the story in the second game, the options that you can choose with your character and where you want to go in the story. It's just epic in every single way. If you've played Mass Effect 2, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I think it's a near perfect RPG. I just think it's so good, and literally everybody should at least play it once. Now we're going to move on to 2D platforming games, and, you know, again, you have just decades of great games to choose from, including some of my all-time favorites like Metroid Zero Mission. You have the Sonic games, of course you have Donkey Kong Country, you have the Shantae games, you even have the original Super Mario Brothers, which you could argue that yes, everybody should play that game at least once. But for my money, I think that actually Super Mario Brothers 3 is just 2D platforming perfection. So what do I like about this game so much? Well, again, I just think that they took the lessons learned from Super Mario Brothers, the original, which again is an absolute classic. If you haven't played it for some weird reason, you totally should. But then they applied all that to the third game. The thing about the third game that I really like is that it just has so much packed into it. It has so many different styles of playing that game and so many random hidden things to find. It's an amazingly designed game. It's just unlike anything that, well, had come out at the time. And also, you know, a lot of games today are kind of copying or at least looking to for inspiration. Moving on to first-person shooters, you just have a ton of great games to choose from, both single player and also online. Now, for me, I actually don't play a lot of online first-person shooters, so for this list, I'm just going to keep it to single-player games. But that said, I do really like the Call of Duty series. Of course, BioShock 1, 2, and 3 are amazing. The Deus Ex games are some of my all-time favorites. Also, some more recent games that I've really enjoyed is like Titanfall 2, of course, the new Wolfenstein games. You have classics like GoldenEye, and then you have some other games like Far Cry. But the one first-person shooter that I think everyone should at least play once is Half-Life 2. So why Half-Life 2? And Again, it's a tough one because, you know, the genre of first-person shooters has really evolved over time. But the thing is, I think Half-Life 2 was sort of like a stake in the ground. There was first-person shooters before it, but then there are first-person shooters after it. And what I mean by that is that Half-Life, you know, was in the first person, but it was also heavily story-driven, and it had great gameplay mechanics. It was the first time I really saw a good use of physics in a first-person shooter in a way that was both satisfying in the shooting, but also in the puzzle solving and getting, you know, where you needed to go. It was just so clever in its design. I also like, too, the fact that, yes, it's a first-person shooter, but then it's also survival horror at times. Plus, they also had really memorable characters. Characters that people still talk about and care about today. When it comes to puzzle games, I feel like in the last 10 years or so, there's been a real resurgence or renaissance of some great and memorable puzzle games. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that so many of us are walking around with these touch devices. It's a interface that really lends itself to puzzle games. And so you have things like Puzzle Quest and Monument Valley and The Room and The Gardens Between and Peggle. And then, of course, you can go back in time and, you know, you have Dr. Mario and stuff like that. But honestly, let's be real here. Every gamer should at least play Tetris once. So why is Tetris so great? Well, you can probably write an entire college thesis on this, and I suspect many have. But in my mind, it's because the game is just so simple and so addictive. It's a puzzle game that really anybody can look at and kind of figure out fairly quickly what to do and have a lot of fun doing it. But because of the way that the game slowly speeds up, the difficulty is very natural in my opinion, and it's very addictive. You always feel like if you just tried a little bit harder, if you just concentrated a little bit more, you would do so much better. And so it just has this addictive, you know, feel to it where you can play it for a few minutes or you can play it for a full hour. And what's so interesting is that this is an old game that people still play today. I mean, if my NES is hooked up or if my Game Boy has batteries in it, I will put my copy of Tetris in there and play a couple rounds. I mean, why not? It's so much fun. And now I want to recommend an open world game. Obviously, some games I've enjoyed a lot are Skyrim. You have the Red Dead Redemption series. You have the 3D Fallout series. Of course, Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Horizon Zero Dawn is a game I absolutely loved to death. And then, of course, you have a little bit more exotic options like No Man's Sky, but in VR. However, the game that I think really nailed that open world vibe in every way is Grand Theft Auto 5. And I'll be honest with you, it's really hard for me to pick this game over the others because each one of them has their own merits, their own style, and they're almost perfect in every way. But really, Grand Theft Auto, I think, just nailed everything that I love about an open world game. For one, it's LA County, which is a real world location that is pretty close, at least in its vibe, to the real thing, which I enjoyed quite a bit. Also, I loved how they had 3 separate characters and how the storylines really interweaved with each other in a very smart and interesting way. That's something that not a lot of open world games do, or at least do successfully. And what's really important about an open world game is that there is a lot of random stuff to do. And again, I feel like they really nailed it in Grand Theft Auto 5. The city and all the surrounding areas are just breathing with life. There is a ton of variety to do in this game. I also like how they had the missions too in the middle of that. So yes, you can drive around and you can steal cars and shoot people or whatever you want to do. But then there was also this very structured missions that gave you focus for just long enough to kind of take you away from the open world aspect of it and then drop you right back in. It felt very natural. I just don't have very much negative to say about Grand Theft Auto 5. It's the one of the series that I actually enjoyed the most. I got all the way to the end, finished it, and immediately wanted to play it again. That's how good it was. I suspect that some of you were probably making bets as to how long it would take for me to talk about racing games because, as you guys know, it's one of my favorite genres. Well, here we are. But of course, I had to make the decision about which one. And the first one, of course, was a little bit easier for me. I had to choose between realistic versus arcade racing games. And if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that I definitely lean towards arcade, even though I do enjoy some of the more realistic ones. But I really do tend to lean more towards Forza Horizon, this Need for Speed series, The Crew, plus some of the classics like Outrun, and of course you have all the Mario Kart games and stuff like that. But if I had to choose one I think every gamer should play at least once, no surprise, it's going to be Burnout 3 Takedown. Now, at first glance, this might seem like just another arcade racing game that came out a couple years ago. It looks a little dated. Yes, it is. But again, it's got it where it counts, and that is the level design, the controls, and the gameplay. What I find interesting is that EA keeps rolling out these remastered versions of Burnout Paradise, which is, you know, the last in the series as of the making of this video, and technically it is the, you know, better looking of them all. But because that game was open world, it doesn't have the structure that Burnout 3 has, specifically in the level design. These levels are classic for a reason. They are just sculpted to give you the maximum amount of fun. And then there's Crash Mode, which is very unique to the Burnout series and something that I think people might assume is tacked on, but in many ways, it's the reason why you play this game, because we used to throw a bunch of gaming parties, and in those parties, you'd have all these people who really weren't hardcore gamers, but we would put the controller in their hand and tell them to play Crash Mode. And at first they might be a little, taken back, not knowing what to do, but they always ended up loving it. You know, typically in a racing game, you don't want to crash, but then here is this mode where it rewards you for doing the biggest, most gnarly crash of all. You know, it's grading you on how much damage you do. And so in many ways, it's like this physics puzzle where if you don't cause enough damage, you have to restart and try a different tactic, maybe take out a bus or, try to slam into this or that. I mean, it's just a fantastic game. And again, anybody can play it. It's just awesome. EA, if you're somehow listening to this, please do a remastered version of Burnout 3 and also Revenge. I'm begging you. Next up is sports games, and this is a bit of a tough one because I don't play a lot of traditional sports games. I don't play football, baseball, basketball, soccer games. So I'm going to kind of lean on you guys in the comments to make your suggestions as to what you think, every gamer should at least check out once. But for me, I do like, the more extreme sports games like the Tony Hawk Pro Skater series, stuff like that. But for this video and the game I think everyone should check out, well, probably not a big of a surprise, but it is SSX Tricky. I had a bit of an internal debate as to whether I should choose SSX Tricky, which is technically the second game in the series, or SSX 3, which is actually my all-time favorite in that series. But I knew that it had to be Tricky. And I knew that because, again, we held these gamer parties where people would come over, and whether you were a hardcore gamer or you were just someone who, maybe had never picked up a PlayStation 2 controller in your life, everybody loved it. And I know this for a fact that when people left, they ended up buying PlayStation 2 consoles because they played this game and loved it so much. As you can see by this footage here, SSX Tricky is a snowboarding game, but they added in so many fun elements to that. I mean, there is just these crazy, insane, over-the-top levels that frankly could not even exist in real life, especially when you get towards the end of the game. But then they also very smartly added in really memorable and fun characters to play. It's one of the few games where I would end up playing every single character and maxing every single character out simply because I loved how their special moves would look, and also their voice acting. They would say stuff that you just loved every single one of them. It's just a really accessible and well-designed sports game that I think anybody can get into and have a lot of fun. It's one of those games where I go back to time and time again. I'll play SSX 3 and I'll play SSX Tricky and have a great time every time I do it. Now I want to recommend a 3D platforming game. Now originally I was going to recommend a Ratchet and Clank game because those are some of my all-time favorites. I've also really enjoyed the Jak and Daxter series, Spyro. You have all those amazing Crash Bandicoot games. But for my money, I think every gamer should at least try Super Mario Odyssey on the Switch. I will admit the Super Mario Odyssey is a bit of a surprise even to me because there are so many great classic 3D platforming games going all the way back to the PlayStation 1. And again, especially the PlayStation 2 era just had a ton of them as well. And Nintendo themselves have released a bunch of great 3D platforming Mario games. I mean, if you think about it, they're kind of the king of all that. So when I first got Super Mario Odyssey, I was like, yeah, I thought it'd be decent, but I was amazed at how Nintendo just doesn't seem to run out of good ideas. This game continued to surprise me at every new level. And that's why I wanted to pick it, because I do think it is a bit of a surprise. I feel like Nintendo, takes what's great about all the previous 3D Mario games, brings them into Odyssey, but then also adds enough new elements to it to keep it fresh and interesting. It's one of those games where I've decided that I'm going to play it annually every single Christmas. And that's what I've been doing for the last couple years. And every time I fire it up, a big old smile comes on my face. I think it is absolute just perfection. Now I want to recommend a third-person action adventure game. This is where you'd find games like, say, the Tomb Raider series, or maybe Dead Space, or the Metal Gear Solid series. But for me, a game that I think is absolute perfection is Uncharted 2. So what makes this game so special, so memorable? Well, it's right off the bat from the opening moments where you are dangling from a train off of a cliff, and it's technically the tutorial, although it doesn't really tell you it's a tutorial, but right off the bat, you're just in like mortal danger learning the gameplay mechanics. It's brilliant. But that's not it, of course. It's just that it has this great, like, epic story and these characters that you immediately love and hate and want to make sure that they can get through, and you love the dialogue between them, the motion capture. Oh man, plus also the gameplay. I mean, the gameplay is really solid. It's a mix of third-person shooting, so it's got this cover-based mechanic with great shooting, and then also it has the platforming. So it's got the 3D platforming, really epic and exotic locales. It's got it all. Now, to be fair, all of the Uncharted games are actually quality, and I've played them all, from the ones on the PlayStation 3 to the PlayStation Vita to the more current ones on the PlayStation 4, as well as the side ones. They're all very good, and so it might seem a little odd for me to recommend you just play Uncharted 2, but the reason why I say that is because each one of them is kind of self-contained. They all exist in the same world, but it's the second game that I feel like that's where they got everything right. The story was great, the locations were amazing, the action was awesome, plus it introduced some characters for the first time that you just grew to love. And so if you're gonna play one of them, you gotta play Uncharted 2. I wanted to recommend a strategy game. Now, these are typically turn-based, but not necessarily. There are a lot of games out there that are also real-time strategy games. But myself, I actually lean more towards the turn-based ones. The other thing to know about strategy games is that there's often a little bit of a learning curve, especially in the beginning, but that can be so rewarding because these games are often very deep. And this is where you'll find games like Final Fantasy Tactics, XCOM, the amazing Advance Wars series. But for my money, I think every single gamer should at least play Civilization once. During the 90s, I had a second job working evenings at a record store, and that afternoon I'd gone and picked up a brand new copy of Civilization 2, took it home, and I was playing it on my 486, and immediately got sucked into this game in a way that few games have done. I mean, this game basically just melted hours away. It's the definition of just one more turn, right? And I remember because I looked up and I realized that I was hours past when I was supposed to be at work. I was like, I don't know where the time went. It was just amazing. I was like, oh my God, I'm like 2 or 3 hours late. I hadn't called. I hadn't even noticed the sun had gone down. It's just one of those kind of games that once you get into it, once you learn how it works, it is unlike anything I've ever played. And what's cool about Civilization, and the reason why it has that name, is because you essentially start at the beginning of civilization. And so you get to choose all these different races, real races on Earth, or, a version of it essentially that's, generated. And then you get to go throughout time and go throughout the different steps of civilizations. And you'll start with the Bronze Age, and then you'll move into the Metal Age, and, you'll go throughout all the different stages, and then you'll eventually get to a modern era. And then you can go beyond that and actually potentially, leave the planet. And it's just such a fun and cool and really interesting game, really well balanced. And the other thing about the game and the series too is that it's continued to inspire people all these years later. And so you'll hear about people going back and playing Civ 1, Civ 2, Civ 4, it's now on Switch. That's the footage that you're seeing right here. So it's a great game. If you haven't played a strategy game like this, you definitely should, because I think you'd probably like it. All right, guys, so that's my 10 games that every gamer should play at least once, but I got to throw in some honorable mentions here really quick at the end. Primarily just to kind of cover my butt a little bit because there's so many to choose from. So the first one, obviously, I want to mention is Miss Pac-Man. If you haven't played a classic arcade game, I do feel like that Miss Pac-Man is a good jumping in point for a lot of people. It still holds up even today. It's so well designed. I actually like it better than the original Pac-Man. That's why I'm saying that. So definitely check out Miss Pac-Man. Also got to do a shout out for Doom 2. Now, of course, I could have also shouted out Doom 1 and also maybe Quake, but what I like about Doom 2 is that, again, it's a first-person shooter, but it's just very simplistic. I feel like pretty much anybody who's even remotely interested in a first-person shooter can go and play Doom 2 and just have a lot of fun. I also want to do a shout out to Diablo 1 and 2. These games, when they came out, really kind of redefined role-playing games because they're so accessible. If you had a mouse and you could click the button, you could have fun playing a role-playing game. And that was so much different than the other role-playing games at the time, which were very stat-driven. They are basically emulating Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. They were turn-based. They took a long time to play, where Diablo just allowed you to jump in and just have fun. And so I think that really appealed to a lot of people. And you saw after that game, a lot of games, started to emulate it. And even today, people are still playing Diablo-like games, Diablo clones. But obviously, guys, there are a ton more games I could have chosen, and I'm really looking forward to checking out your comments down in the video below, because I know I'm going to have those moments where I slap my forehead and go, oh, I should have thought of that game, And yeah, that's what makes these kind of videos and these kind of lists really fun. So, all right, guys, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for subscribing. Take care.